To understand the life of Emily Brontë, you have to understand the landscape that shaped her. The Yorkshire moors are not just a backdrop for her writing, they are a force of nature, vast, indifferent, and incredibly powerful. For Emily, the moors represented a kind of spiritual freedom that stood in constant tension with the rigid, often suffocating reality of her daily life. Her story is one of profound duality, the woman who was a practical, tireless housekeeper by day, but a brooding, visionary dreamer by night. The foundation of the Brontë family was built on a series of early, heavy losses. It began with the death of their mother, Maria Branwell, a gentle and independent woman. Her passing left the children, Maria Elizabeth, Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne, to be raised by their father, Patrick. Patrick was a man of intense will and deep respectability, a clergyman who commanded the parsonage, but he was also emotionally distant. After Maria died, the family's domestic life shifted toward a much stricter, more disciplined environment under the supervision of an aunt, Elizabeth Branwell. This was a period of confinement for the children, a time when they learned to wear what biographers often call a mask. They developed a demure, well-behaved exterior to satisfy the expectations of the Victorian world, but underneath that mask they were cultivating intense, private, and often wild imaginative worlds. Long before they wrote novels, the siblings created sprawling, complex imaginary universes, places like Glass Town, Angria, and Gondal. These weren't just childhood games. They were sophisticated literary exercises where the siblings could explore power, passion, and tragedy far beyond the limits of their isolated village. This sense of a hidden inner life was reinforced by a very real, very public tragedy. As the children grew, the elder sisters were sent to a boarding school at Cowan's Bridge. It was a rigid, neglectful institution where the conditions were appalling. Emily, the youngest student at the time, was described as the pet nursling of the school. But that sweetness couldn't protect the girls from the environment. The school was plagued by poor food, unsanitary conditions, and frequent outbreaks of infectious disease. It was here that the eldest sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, fell ill with typhoid and tuberculosis. They were sent home, but they died shortly after. This was a pivotal trauma for the surviving sisters, especially Charlotte and Emily. It instilled in them a lifelong, deep-seated distrust of social institutions, the schools, the churches, and the organized structures of society that promised protection but delivered only death and neglect. The loss of their eldest sisters left a void in the family and a lingering shadow of mortality that would permeate Emily's later work. As the Brontë children entered young adulthood, the family's struggle for survival became more intense. The sisters tried to find their own way in the world, seeking a professional independence that was rare for women of their time. Charlotte and Emily sought this independence through teaching, even travelling to Brussels for a time to study and find work. For Charlotte, Brussels was a place of ambition and adaptation. But for Emily, it was a cultural clash. She found the religious atmosphere of the continent an affront to her spirit and famously refused to adopt Belgian fashions, preferring to remain as God made her. She was often mocked by her peers for her ungainly figure and her monosyllabic nature. Yet those who looked closer saw a formidable intellect. Constantine Heger, who was in charge of the academy, spoke of Emily's powerful reason and imperious will, suggesting that she possessed a head for logic and argument that was rare indeed in a woman. Despite this intellectual awakening, Emily's spirit remained tied inextricably to the uncultivated wildness of the moors. She struggled to hold down steady employment because her need for solitude and her connection to the landscape was so profound. She would often try to find work, only to find herself exhausted by the social demands and the confinement of indoor labour, eventually returning to the parsonage to help her family. While the sisters were trying to build a future, the internal structure of the Brontë household was beginning to fracture. Their brother, Branwell, became the family's great tragedy. He was a man of brilliant purposelessness. He had inherited his father's intense passion and creative potential, but he lacked the moral discipline to channel it. Instead, he spiraled into a devastating cycle of alcoholism and opium addiction. The domestic life at the parsonage became a harrowing landscape. As Branwell's addiction grew, the home was marked by nocturnal violence and the slow physical decline of their father, who was losing his sight to progressive blindness. The family was living in a state of constant, quiet crisis. In the midst of this, Emily emerged as the family's silent, tireless anchor. She took on the grueling, practical labor of the household, acting as a housekeeper and a caregiver. She was the one who stayed steady when everything else was falling apart. There is a striking moment in her life when she had to physically drag a drunken, unconscious Branwell from a room that had caught fire, risking her own life to save him. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated her role, the woman of action and endurance who held the physical world together while her family's spirit was being torn apart. It was in these moments of extreme hardship and isolation that Emily's true voice began to emerge. While she performed her domestic duties, she was writing in secret. Her poetry was not the polite sentimental verse expected of a Victorian lady, it was something much more elemental, something with a supernatural intensity. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a necessity, a way to process the shadows of her own home. The sisters eventually decided to bring their private worlds into the light, but they did so under a layer of protection. They published a volume of poetry using the pseudonyms Ellis, Currer, and Acton Bell. This was their way of bypassing the social expectations of their gender and class. They wanted their work to be judged on its own merit, without the mask of their identity getting in the way. The first volume was a commercial failure, but it contained a spark that could not be ignored. A single critical review identified the voice of Ellis Bell as one of extraordinary power. That moment of recognition, born from the crucible of personal tragedy and social isolation, marked the transition from private dreaming to the public literary genius that would eventually define their legacy. When she finally published Wuthering Heights, the reaction was mixed. Many contemporary critics found the characters coarse and immoral, unable to handle the raw, destructive passions Emily laid bare on the page. But the power of the prose was undeniable. When we look back at Emily's life and her work, there is a sense that her fiction was a mirror of her reality. There is a theory often discussed by biographers called the mirror effect. It suggests that the darkness, the wildness, and the intense, often destructive passions found in her writing were direct reflections of the real-world tragedies and moral struggles occurring within her own household. The chaos of Branwell's addiction and the isolation of the parsonage provided the raw, elemental material for her imagination. This brings us to the central conflict of her life, the tension between nature and society. For Emily, society was a collection of rules, institutions, and expectations that felt suffocating. The moors, by contrast, were liberating. In the moors, there was no need for the mask. There was only the wind, the stone, and the raw, unvarnished truth of existence. Her writing often feels like an attempt to bridge these two worlds, to take the intense, private truths of the soul and force them into the structured, disciplined language of literature. We can see this duality in Emily herself. She was a woman of incredible practical strength, capable of managing a household and caring for the broken and the dying, yet she possessed a mind that lived in a different dimension entirely. She was a woman of the earth and a woman of the spirit, simultaneously. The Brontë sisters were often described as a parahelion, a phenomenon where three suns appear in the sky instead of one. They were distinct, individual spirits, yet they were unified by their shared experience and their shared struggle. Charlotte was the strategist, the one who navigated the social world to protect the family. Anne was the steady, observant one. And Emily was the wild, visionary core. In the end, Emily Bronte's life was a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure through isolation and grief. She died at the young age of 30, only a year after the publication of her masterpiece. She didn't just survive the shadows of her upbringing, she transformed them. She took the silence of the moors and the darkness of her family's struggles and turned them into a voice that was so powerful, so unconventional, and so profoundly human that it changed literature forever. She proved that even when the world demands a mask, the truth of the individual can still find its way through the cracks.